Hello, and welcome to this video lesson of the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. It's one of the longer poems in the anthology, but it's also a great story, which hopefully will be a lot clearer by the time you finish the video. We'll begin by clarifying some key context and background information, and then we'll work on to the bigger ideas and the analysis as well. So, My Last Duchess. It was written by Robert Browning in 1842. He's best known for using dramatic monologues. These are basically poems that have speakers who are unique characters telling a story. So when you're reading the poem, it's not Browning, it's the speaker, which we'll get onto in a second. Browning liked to create characters who were quite disturbed and twisted. So he based this poem on a true story. So the speaker is supposed to be someone called Duke Alfonso II, who lived in Ferrara, Italy. It was a couple of hundred years before Browning was alive, so it must have been a story that he'd heard somewhere that inspired the creation of the poem. The Duchess in the poem was his first wife, Lucrezia de' Medici, who died in 1561, aged 17. Now, that was only 2 years after he married her. In real life, Lucrezia died in suspicious circumstances and might have been poisoned. So you get why Browning was interested in this story if he liked twisted characters. The poem is set in 1564, which is 3 years after the death of the Duchess, which obviously is important. An emissary, so that's kind of like a messenger or a representative, has been sent to see the Duke from the Count of Tyrol. The Count is the father of the Duke's next wife. So throughout the poem, the Duke is showing the emissary a painting of his dead wife, and he suggests that she was unfaithful to him. He even hints that he may have been involved in her death. And if you look at that image there, it's a decent representation of what is actually going on throughout the poem. He's picking out pieces of art for the emissary. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through the poem, and I'm going to take it bit by bit, really chunk it into tiny little details so we understand the little kind of intricacies, the little key moments that you might miss if you just read it all the way through on your own. So Ferrara, it begins with the location of the Duke's, so with this confirmation that it was Duke Alfonso II. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. Now, it's interesting that he says my last Duchess. That confirms that the Duke is the speaker. There's lots of other effects about that as well, but I'll save that for the analysis. He also says that's my last Duchess painted on the wall. And when he says that, he's pointing. So if we can imagine, I've tried to mock up an example of what it'd look like here. He's pointing at this painting. And so when he's saying that, he's picking it out to the person that he's speaking to. And obviously he reveals that she's now dead. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. So we've got more context added here. We've got Fra Pandolf, who I'm sure we can work out was the artist. There's enough clues there. Hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. The fact that he mentions him by name becomes important for different reasons later in the poem. Will it please you to sit and look at her? So who's you? We call this person the addressee. So to summarize, we've got Browning has written the poem. The speaker, who is a character, is Duke Alfonso II, and he is talking to the addressee, who we're not actually supposed to know yet. It's supposed to be a mystery who he's talking to. That's supposed to be revealed later in the poem, but we have cheated a little bit here, and we know that it is the emissary of the Count. Will it please you sit and look at her, I said, Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none but puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there, so, not the first, are you to turn and ask thus. This part can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes if you read it the first time especially, so let's decode it. When he says, never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, he's just saying strangers always wonder what the expression on her face is, how it got there. Countenance just means expression. The depth and passion of its earnest glance. When he says earnest, he just means kind of natural, honest. And then later on, and seemed that they would ask me if they durst how such a glance came there. So people tend to be quite curious about how the expression came to be on her face. Don't worry though, It will explain later what the expression is. But we've missed the most important bit out of this section. Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. So we've learned something new about the visual representation we're supposed to have in our heads. So yes, we've got our hallway, yes, we've got the artwork, but we also have this important new information. The Duke interrupts himself to say that no one is allowed to see this painting of the Duchess unless he pulls back the curtain that he's put over it. So actually, this is more like what we're supposed to imagine now. It becomes a very important metaphor, but again, we'll analyze it later. Are you to turn and ask thus, Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. At this point, the Duke starts to flash back to what it was like to be married to the Duchess. You'll see later that this is quite tactical from him. Here, he's talking about the spot of joy on her cheeks. That just means blushing, essentially. So it's a kind of red flush on her cheeks. Why would she be blushing? Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. You'll notice the quotation marks in this bit. The reason for that is because the Duke is now beginning to imagine these scenarios, that what must have happened in order for her to have been blushing when she was getting painted. And that means that the quotation marks that you see here, these are different possibilities that he is imagining Fra Pandolf must have said to her to make her blush. So he thinks that Fra Pandolf must have complimented her. Maybe he told her that paint could never hope to reproduce her beauty, and that's why she's blushing. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. When it says courtesy, it just means that maybe he's saying the compliment was polite and enough to make her blush. But in these 3 lines here, the Duke is beginning to show what he thought the Duchess was actually like as a person, as well as some of the reasons that he was dissatisfied with her as a wife. She was too easily pleased by everything, and he hints that she was too flirtatious and maybe even unfaithful. Again, we'll come on to it later. Sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bow of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode round a terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. This section is very interesting as well, because he's listing things that he thinks she used to value as being equal. So let's start with the things that made her smile, all the things that made her happy. My favourite at her breast, that just means his love, his attention. She has him as a husband. Okay, so that's what he starts with, because to him, that's the most important thing. The dropping of the daylight in the west, so beautiful sunsets. Bow of cherries, so it just means a branch of cherries, so a gift. And the white mule. All 4 of these things he has a problem with, because she seems to value all of them, all of these beautiful things in life, equally. And he really doesn't like that. And we'll find more about that out in a minute. She thanked men, good, but thanked them somehow, I not know how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. And this is where we really get to the important part of the poem, where we start to find out his motivation as a character. Browning's slowly teasing out the menacing side of his character. So this is really important. Now we learn the biggest reason that the Duke was so dissatisfied with the Duchess. Yes, he was jealous, but it was the fact that she wasn't totally devoted to him because of his status and power, having a 900 years old name, that got to him the most. In his mind, no one and nothing should rival this gift that he gave to her by marrying her. And that is the big issue. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that and you disgust me. Here you miss, or there you exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. This part of the poem, I think, is possibly the most difficult because the language is quite difficult to decode. But what he's saying is very simple. When he says stoop to blame, stoop means lower yourself. So trifling means like a small, insignificant, troublesome behavior. So what he's saying is, who would lower themselves to actually say something about this? How could I possibly bring myself to actually tell her that she needs to be more devoted to me? And if we look at the blue things here, even if you had skill in speech, which I have not, um, even if she let herself be lessoned so if she learned her lesson, even then would be some stooping. So even if you actually spoke to her and she changed her behavior and started doing as you say, that would still be stooping. Essentially, what he's saying in this section is he wasn't willing to actually speak to her to try to solve these problems that they had. He wasn't trying in any way to solve it by saying, I think you should respect me more. And this is super important as well. And I choose never to stoop. The Duke admits that talking to the Duchess about what she is doing to upset him was never an option. His pride in his status meant that he could never lower himself to actually tell her to devote herself to him. So he thinks it should be obvious. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her. But who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. So it's important, again, this section, this is probably the most important part because it confirms the moment when she died. Let's just phrase it that way. So the Duke tells the emissary that he ended the marriage, but it's not explicit, it's not obvious that he's saying that he killed her. It's kind of coded, it's hinted. But to us as readers, we can work it out, especially knowing the background context of the story, that that is what's happened. I gave commands implies that he had someone else do it, so he wasn't directly responsible. Interestingly, all smiles stop together. You could have two interpretations of this. Does he mean that all the smiles that she used to give to everybody else have gone? All of those smiles have disappeared? Or does he mean that as well as having his Duchess killed, he had others killed as well, like the boy who gave the bow of cherries? It's not clear. I think it's open to interpretation, that, but probably more likely the first one. Will it please you to rise? So now he's returning back to the addressee. He's returning back to the emissary. We'll meet the company below them. I repeat, the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. So what's he saying there? So if we decode a couple of bits, the company below them, the Count your master. So in this hallway they're in, there's clearly rooms underneath that have got more people there. Are they there to arrange the details of his next marriage? Well, it seems quite likely, yes, that this emissary was just one of many, and the rest of the party is down below. Munificence means being generous, especially with money. Ample warrant just means enough reason. And dowries were payments given to grooms by the brides in weddings of the past when they were arranged. So when he's saying the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, he's basically saying I've got a lot of reasons here to negotiate a decent payment for my marriage to this young lady. So we're getting a sense here that the Duke is clearly very greedy as well. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. That's the ending of the poem, and a lot of people think that the ending of the poem is quite strange, oddly insignificant, but it's quite clever. So let's start with these lines. His fair daughter's self, so he's talking about the Count's daughter now, his next wife, as I avowed at starting, is my object. The innocent interpretation here is that he wants to devote his future to this new woman, but he says object. Now, he might mean the object of my desire, maybe, but knowing the Duke as we now know him, it could be a pun, and it could mean actually that he still wants a wife to be like a possession. He wants her to be more devoted to him than his last Duchess. And then the ending of the poem. So, this image down here is what he's talking about. If we imagine then that all of this was in a hallway and he's talking to the emissary about this painting that's behind a curtain, the end of the poem, they've started to move on because they're going to go downstairs and negotiate this deal. So, the end of the dramatic monologue seems strangely unimportant. As they leave, he points out another piece of artwork to the emissary, a bronze statue of Neptune, so that's the Roman god of the oceans. And he name drops another famous artist, Claus of Innsbruck. This could explain why he named Frau Pandolf earlier in the poem. He boasts about his possessions just as he boasts about solving the problem of his ex-wife and her not being devoted enough to him. He does not care at all about what he did, and in fact cares more about showing off his prestige, his status, his power, his wealth. And that's the poem. So if we're going to move on now to themes, look at it a little deeper, maybe look at some of the craft in the quotes that Browning created when he was making this poem. So a theme, once again, is a recurring idea throughout a text. You might have got ideas already about what the themes are in this. But the ones we're going to have a look at are pride and identity, jealousy, and power and control. There's lots more to say about them than we are going to say about them. And there are other themes. You could even look at the theme of innocence, the idea of weighing up how innocent the Duchess was. But we'll start with pride and identity. So, notice Neptune, though. Let's deal with the ending of the poem. So when he says, notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, it's just like the beginning of the poem. So the Duke is returning to his normal habit, his normal mode of talking about his own possessions, his own artwork. He's proud to own it. Even though he suspected Frau Pandolf of flirting with his wife, or possibly more, he still says his name. And that's interesting because at the end we see that he likes to name drop. He likes to boast. There's no trace of guilt at all in the poem. It's just about him and his property. She thanked men good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. There's lots to say about this. First of all, he calls it a gift. And that conveys how he believed that he was giving her a privilege by just being associated with him. And I think that kind of helps us understand why he's so outraged by what happened. He's almost in disbelief that anyone could ever value anything as highly as the status of a name that old. It shows his priorities are deeply selfish and driven by personal prestige. And also the ending part of this bit, with anybody's gift, there's a sense of disgust that he would ever be labelled as equal to anyone else by her. How dare she? Even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. So if we look at stooping again, his outlook on life is dominated by how he looks and how his status is affected, to the point where he has her murdered before trying to solve the problem civilly. So instead of actually speaking to her, he has her murdered. And we know at the end of the poem that he's organizing for his kind of marriage with his next wife. So that relates to the idea of social gain. Never to stoop. So the superlative never demonstrates that he seems to feel proud of his decision. He doesn't feel, it's not that he just doesn't feel bad for it. He's proud almost because he believes that he is above trying to convince her to devote herself to him. It's her fault. I repeat, the Count your master's no munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. I repeat is a very interesting phrase. What the verb does is it implies that the Duke has brought up the matter of payment many times. So does this mean that the Duke is obsessed not just with his status, but with raising his status as well? When it says the Count, the Duke, to the Duke, a wife is an accessory and a way of gaining more money and power. So this Count, the Count of Tyrol, clearly was a more powerful and wealthy man. The Duke wants to be involved with that. That's why he's marrying the daughter. Okay, moving on to jealousy. Say 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. He starts a couple of lines with "Sir" when he's addressing the emissary, and what this does is it makes it sound like he's delivering some difficult news, like he's about to say something shocking, and the result of that is that it makes him sound like he was the victim. He's trying to justify the decisions that he made during this kind of um, situation with his ex-wife. Her husband's presence only. This is the only time we actually hear him call himself that. So while justifying himself, he labels himself as her husband. Yes, it gets more sympathy because it makes him sound like the victim again, but he never shows any other evidence of valuing her as an equal. So it seems like it's a very tactical use of the word husband there. And obviously, Browning was very clever in making him fixate on tiny details. What this does is, as well as making him sound jealous, it makes him sound paranoid, makes him sound obsessive. Paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. So this is the bit where he's imagining the compliment that Frau Pandolf must have said to her. That's why the language is quite strange. What I mean by that is, he says that this blush on her cheeks dies along her throat. But the choice of the verb is really unusual. So instead of saying that her blush fades, he uses dies and throat, which together they evoke death. We would associate those words together with dying, murder. Is this a hint at his more murderous side and the rage or jealousy he felt when he was talking to the emissary and he was talking about what must have happened between Frau Pandolf and his wife? Did he almost let it slip here? She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So Browning uses phrases like too soon and too easily to show how the Duke criticised the Duchess's carefree behaviour. He hated seeing her enjoy other aspects of life, again showing how possessive and dominant he wanted to be. But also, at the end, the adverb everywhere goes beyond criticism. It implies that she was unfaithful. But this is the key thing about this poem. How trustworthy is this character? How much should we trust the Duke when he says that she was unfaithful? Some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace. All and each would draw from her alike the approving speech. When he says officious, he means kind of like meddlesome, trouble. So the Duke is clearly angry and resentful about other men who were kind to her. Also, would draw alike from her the approving speech. There's a sense of disbelief from the Duke that she could value an animal like the white mule as being equal in creating joy to his gift, his power, his marriage. Onto power and control. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. So back to the beginning of the poem. The pronoun my implies possession, ownership, and last furthers this idea because it makes it sound like it's a long line of things that he's had, in this case, wives. It devalues the idea of equality in marriage. It also devalues the idea that he was marrying for anything other than status, wealth. It's clearly not love. Looking as if she were alive. He repeats this quite a lot throughout the poem. He seems to be almost proud of how lifelike the painting is now that she's dead. So this painting will have been made obviously when she was alive, and it's driven him to the point where he's kind of gained this jealousy, developed this obsession, but now he's gained control over the situation by having her murdered. It's not troubling him anymore. He actually kind of respects how detailed the painting is. By repeating it, it could be argued that he feels no guilt because he regained the power he wanted. Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. So none is clearly important to him. It's important, the idea of exclusivity, that he exclusively just him, it's only him who can do it. That's important to him. He wants that level of control that he didn't have when she was alive. The curtain, that's a really important symbol for control because he can draw it and he can close it. He is the only one who can draw it. So he's fully in control of her now. Who she sees, who sees her, he's in control. So this is how he's managed to get what he wants. She's hidden away until he wants to see her. So he finally got what he wanted. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her. But who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave command, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. To him, status and power should be above everything, clearly. But the fact that he's questioning the idea that why would she be smiling at anyone else in the same way she smiles at me? Their marriage is meaningless if she respects him in the same way as others. Again, he wants that total devotion. He wants that respect above all other things. This commands, the noun commands, reinforces the power he has, the fact that he could do that. And also, it sounds like another boast. It makes him sound stronger. Browning uses caesura in this grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. So just as a reminder, caesura is when we have breaks within lines. So we've got the caesura there, the question mark, making a stop. Then we've got this grew, so the semicolon, making a stop. And then I gave commands, same again. We've got the semicolon, that's actually at the end of the line, but it's still another pause. Then all smiles stop together. Then we've got this end stop here. So the punctuation is really important on these two lines. What it does is it comes across as almost like a list, a snap and quick list. This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. So the effects of that are, it makes it sound quick. It makes it sound simple, as though it was an easy process to have her murdered. In addition, it might also convey how easy he found it to commit to having his wife murdered. It sounded like it wasn't a big deal to him at all, like it wasn't an emotionally distressing time for him at all. It was, he'd had enough, so he got her murdered. Simple as that. So then all smiles stopped together. Back to the idea that we were talking about earlier. Does this mean that he had her killed, so all of her smiles stopped? Or did it also mean that other people, other men, met their untimely end as well? Either way, it means that he is getting satisfaction out of ending the smiles. He's the victor here. He's the winner. And he likes that fact. He enjoys that fact. So he controlled the situation and abused his power, and he's ended up with what he wanted. And that was the majority of the analysis. There's plenty more to say. Obviously, there's a lot more that we could have said if it was in a proper lesson. But we'll move on to the big ideas and messages of the poem. Again, there's even more of those. So we learn that power and pride can corrupt. Obviously, the Duke was corrupted by his own power not being respected, so he used his power to commit a sin. Jealousy can become obsessive. I think that's fairly obvious in his own character throughout the poem. Power and status lead to greed. Yep. So he's by the end of the poem, he's also wanting payment as well as a new, young, beautiful wife. Powerful people abuse their positions, something that we see in other poems as well. Materialism over morality. So the way that the Duke feels pride over this hallway of art that he has, the way that he's showing it off, the way that he's boasting, while at the same time having been responsible for the death of his wife, demonstrates that his morality has been completely eroded away by this materialism, having things, owning things, this status in society. And that is My Last Duchess. As always, like with the other poems, there's lots of useful resources for you if you needed to know more about this poem, if you were unclear about anything. I definitely recommend genius.com, and obviously make sure you ask your teachers as well if you need some help. The GCSE English Revision Drive is obviously full of resources as well. There's 2 guides per poems, plus obviously other video lessons like this. I hope it was useful. Thanks for listening.